What about ancient Egypt always surprises people. Everyone believes they are familiar with the narrative. Large pyramids, ornate tombs, and animal-headed gods. But they fail to see that waiting for mud was the foundation of the entire civilization. Mud, straight up, not just any mud either. I'm referring to a very particular type that only happened once a year when the Nile decided to submerge everything that these folks had constructed. Imagine your entire world submerged when you wake up one day. The finest news conceivable, not a catastrophe. Living next to the Nile was not at all like what you see in films. While most people think of ancient Egyptians as just building pyramids or lounging in temples, their everyday lives actually involved something far more intense. Anticipating and surviving a huge flood that would either bring about life or complete destruction. Oh, and please consider liking or subscribing if you find these stories entertaining. I'm really interested in where you're all listening. Please leave a remark stating where you are and what time it is there. The fact that people throughout the world are falling asleep to this never ceases to amaze me. Okay, let's return to ancient Egypt. It's going to be quite the journey, I assure you. But first, settle in. Really, reposition those pillows. You'll want to be comfortable where we're headed, so pull up that blanket. Congratulations then. Ancient Egypt is where you just woke up to. You open your eyes to the darkness, not your bedroom's soft blackness now, with the faintest glimmer of streetlight peeking in through the blinds. No, this is the utter darkness of an unelectric world. The heat is heavy in the air, and you sense something, a rich, earthy, slightly pungent smell, as you inhale your first conscious breath. It's the aroma of the Nile's moist greenery and dirt. Instead of a memory foam mattress, you're resting on a reed mat. The packed earth underneath feels nice on your back. The faintest lighting in the sky can be seen through the little window high on the mudbrick wall. Dawn is already coming. Sounds seep in. The sound of distant water splashing, donkeys braying, and voices calling. This is not a nobleman's villa or some opulent palace in Thebes. You're in a modest house on Elephantine, an island that forms a natural border with Egypt to the south, where the first cataract is located. The structure you're in is completely constructed of mud brick and has high walls to block away the day's intense heat. Because your house is higher up on the island, it will be secure from the rising water. You sit up and stretch. Merit Tatan is your name, and this is arguably the most significant day of your early years. You are 16 years old, and this is your first year helping the priests at the Neometer measure the inundation of the Nile. Egypt's fortunes for the upcoming year are predicted by this antique stone gauge. Your naked feet feel different on the floor. A little wet. That's novel. Your heart starts to race as you pause. Is it possible? Has it started yet? Outside, a voice calls. Meriting. Act quickly. It's taking place. Your father is that. Amun-Hat, the Neometer's top priest. You pick up a plain kilt made of white linen and put it on. Not enough time to eat or wash. Nothing else matters now if your father is telling the truth. You enter the pre-dawn light outside. The air feels like a moist, warm blanket. It's already hot, even though it's early. It's so humid that you could practically drink it. Between the mud brick buildings, the tiny street is bustling with activity. Everyone is moving towards the Nilometer with a goal and in the same direction. Your father says, "There you are, showing up by your side." Even though it's early, his shaved head shines with perspiration. He maintains a strict personal hygiene regimen as a priest, keeping his white linen robes immaculate and his body hairless. It's beginning sooner than we thought. At the first cascade, the waters rise. Through the twisting streets, you follow him. Other families are coming out of their houses with anxious expressions. Youngsters rush forward, thrilled by the noise. Everyone has been hoping and waiting for this time. As you turn a corner, you can see the Nilometer. It's only a stone staircase that descends into a well that is connected to the Nile by a narrow canal. It's not a particularly striking building. However, it stands for nothing less than life. There's already a crowd. You see the governor, his immaculate linen shining white in the rising light, standing away from the ordinary people. He is surrounded by a bubble of space created by his attendants. In preparation for the ceremony that would usher in Akhet, the season of flooding, the other priests are also there. You've spent your entire life hearing about this moment. Of course, you've seen the neometer before, but this one is unique. You will never see it in action till now. You will participate for the first time in the sacred measuring that will decide taxes, food supplies, and perhaps even the kingdom's survival. The majority of people are unaware of the fact that the flood affected every aspect of ancient Egypt, from the lowest farmer to the pharaoh himself. Famine resulted from insufficient water. Devastation was the result of too much. A few exact engravings on stone were all that separated life from death. You follow your father beyond the throng to the actual Nilometer. Water is already filling the first few steps of the stairs as it seeps into the well. As he adjusts your kilt, your father murmurs, "The king's messenger will be watching." No matter how many we report, they will be sent to Memphis and then to the palace. The divine being himself will want to know right away whether we will have plenty or not. You take a deep breath. The burden of accountability falls like a boulder onto your shoulders. This is not merely a religious rite. The tax rate for the entire kingdom will be established by the measurements made here. It will be disastrous if the Nile rises to 14 cubits. Water to irrigate the land is scarce. The harvest will be bountiful and taxes may be raised if it exceeds 16 cubits. 16 cubits is the ideal height. As the expression goes, exactly. However, it will be disastrous if the water level rises to 18 cubits or more. Lives lost, villages ruined, fields washed away. There will be nothing to tax at 18 cubits, hence no taxes may be collected. Your father lifts his arms, and the throng goes quiet. Akhet's season has begun, he says. It's here, happy ruler of the fishes and marsh birds. We are here to quantify his blessing. For this moment, you have been trained for years. You assist in setting up the measuring cord that is marked with knots at exact intervals using calm hands. Together, you will determine the water's height once your father lowers it into the well. You notice something strange as the ceremony starts. The water is rising more quickly than usual. The Nile typically rises steadily over several days. However, the water is already visibly creeping up the steps minute by minute. Your dad also notices. His expression remains unchanged. He is too skilled for that. However, you notice the glimmer of worry in his eyes. The measurement starts as he leans down and murmurs, "Watch carefully, my son. This is not normal. The gods are sending us a message." As your father descends the steps until he is ankle-deep in the rising water, you grasp one end of the chain. The audience observes a tight quiet. Everything hinges on this instant. After taking the measurement, your father ascends once more. He nods slightly to the governor, and the official's countenance shows relief. Your dad looks out into the throng. There are already 12 cubits and more to come. This year, Happy brings a powerful flood. We will have plenty, so get your farms and storehouses ready. The crowd lets forth a cheer. This early in the season, 12 cubits suggests the flood will probably reach the ideal 16. Just the proper amount, not too little nor too much. However, your father yanks you away as the crowd thins, his expression solemn. He responds softly. I told them what they needed to hear. The reality, however, is more nuanced. Too fast the water is rising. We might see 18 cubits or more if it keeps going this way. Catastrophe. Why didn't you inform them then? You inquire. Because nobody benefits from panic. Additionally, I might be mistaken. The ways of the gods are inscrutable. The rise might slow, maybe not. Every day we have to measure and observe. We also need to pray. He holds on to your shoulder. The Nilometer priest's real work is this: meriting. Knowing when to speak and when to remain silent is just as important as measuring. Our knowledge is just as important to our lives as our precision. On your way home, you notice that the neighborhood is already getting ready for the flood. Men are using more clay to reinforce their dwellings' mudbrick walls. Food shops are being moved by women to higher ground. Everywhere they can, kids are lending a hand by bringing tiny objects to safety. You understand that this is the true Egypt? Not the enormous monuments or the opulent palaces, but common folks getting ready for the yearly miracle, and perhaps catastrophe, that is the flood of the Nile. This cycle is important to all facets of life. It is the foundation of the calendar itself. Shemu is the harvest, Pere is the growing season, and Aket is the flooding. Your mother is getting ready for the flood in her own manner back home. She's preparing beer, which is thicker and more nourishing than you may think. It's more akin to liquid bread and is a mainstay of the Egyptian diet during floods when access to fresh food may be limited. Bread and beer that are stored become even more crucial. She asks, hardly raising her head from her task, "Did it go well?" According to Father, this year's flood will be good. You carefully follow his lead in your response. She gives a contented nod. Then, taxes won't be too high, and we'll have a healthy harvest. The gods are good. You assist her in brewing by using a stone mortar and pestle to pound grain. After the stress of the morning, the comfortable motion is comforting. You can see the Nile flowing serenely in the distance through the doorway, but you are aware that a significant shift in its nature is imminent. More upriver news comes in during the day. Indeed, the flood is approaching more quickly than normal. Water levels in areas nearer the first cataract are already increasing quickly, according to messengers. The governor has called your father away for an urgent meeting. You ascend to your home's roof, which is the highest spot you can readily reach, while he's away. Much of the island and the surrounding river are visible from this location. Already, the Nile appears different, faster, higher, and muddier against its banks. The first fields are starting to vanish beneath the rising water in the distance. It's an odd sight. The land gradually disappears and merges with the river, but in reality, this seeming destruction is creation. Egypt would only be desert without this yearly drowning. This fertile soil is deposited across the floodplain by the floodwaters, which carry rich black silt from Ethiopia's highlands. The soil will be renewed and prepared for planting once the waters subside. The terrain is totally altered by the water. The majority of the floodplain will be underwater during Aket's peak, transforming Egypt into a network of islands connected by elevated walkways. Higher-lying villages become cut off from one another. Boat travel is particularly challenging. Numerous enterprises and crafts ceased operations. Farmers are drafted for construction projects or other labor when they are unable to work their submerged fields. It's a moment of celebration and peril, of faith and fear. The stress is considerably greater this year since the waters are rising more quickly than usual. At noon, your father comes back with his face drawn. The governor tells your mother that he is concerned. 15 years ago, when the flood reached 19 cubits and 3 towns were carried away, the floods surged this rapidly. You were born 15 years ago. You were too little to recall that horrible flood, but you have heard tales about it. With her hands motionless in her work, your mother asks, "What does this mean for us?" According to your father, we should be safe here on the island. He stops short of saying, but many of the lowland fields and villages. He doesn't have to. You help your father take measurements at the niometer for the following few days. The water is still rising more quickly than anyone can recall. It has already gained 14 cubits on the 6th day. Underwater, fields along the river are vanishing. Oddly enough, though, life continues. After all, this is Egypt. Every year, the flood occurs, and people have adjusted. The main form of transportation is now boats. Temporary marketplaces appear on elevated terrain. Despite the danger, kids splash and laugh as they play in the shallower areas of the floodwaters. You attend to a meeting with the governor and other officials one morning with your father. There is tension in the room. There have been negative reports from all throughout the region. Near the second cataract, 2 communities are totally submerged underwater. According to one official, the people escaped, but their homes and most of their possessions are gone. The watermarks at the Temple of Keenum are already higher than they've been in 20 years, according to another. The governor asks your father directly, "What are we to tell Pharaoh?" Your father inhales deeply and says, his tax collectors will be making their plans based on our reports. Be honest with him. It's a very high flood. Taxes ought to be modified appropriately. This year, some areas won't yield anything. If their irrigation systems are able to effectively channel the retreating waters, others might get the best crop in a generation. The governor gives a somber nod. What about the individuals? Refugees from flooded communities are already coming in. They need to be fed and housed. Firmly, your father says. It's the will of the joyful. Sharing is a duty for those who are fortunate enough to be safe. We might be looking for a place to stay next year. In that instant, you come to a significant realization. There are more uses for the niometer than measuring water. It serves as a gauge of Egyptian society as a whole, of how people handle one another in times of crisis and prosperity brought on by the flood. Your father gestures towards a huge stone building in the distance as you exit the conference. A granary used to store excess grain. Do you see that? It was constructed following the great flood of your birth year, he continues. Following the catastrophe, the prior one was washed away. Throughout Egypt, the godly king ordered the construction of new granaries on higher land. These days, every district keeps a reserve big enough to sustain its residents for 2 years if needed. You mean 2 years? Feeling impressed? Yes, since the flood can occasionally fail twice in a succession. Everyone would go hungry without those reserves. He gives you a serious gaze. This explains the significance of the work we do at the Niometer. Our measures aid in determining the amount of grain that needs to be distributed, traded, and stored. There is a crowd gathered at the Nilometer once more when you get back there for the evening measurement, but the atmosphere is different this time. It is more sad and nervous. News of the unexpected deluge has spread. You are right behind your father as he pushes through the mob. You both stop short when you get to the stone staircase. In a matter of hours, the water had risen significantly. It is currently 15 cubits and continues to rise quickly. What you both observe is confirmed by your father's somber expression as he takes the measurement. He doesn't try to disguise the reality when he turns to face the audience. 15 cubits and rising, he declares. The flood is more severe than anticipated. People who live in low-lying houses should relocate right away. Boat owners should get ready to help with evacuations if necessary. You witness the crowd arranging themselves with well-honed efficiency rather than in a panic. They have had dangerous floods before, and this one won't be the last. Immediately, neighbors start planning ways to support one another. On higher ground, the wealthy provide space in their larger dwellings. Owners of boats donate their boats. The fact that the Nile has influenced more than simply Egypt's economy and agriculture strikes you. It has molded its citizens and produced a community that is capable of uniting during times of distress. The sound of the river wakes you up that night. As the flood continues to build, you can hear the sound of the water rushing louder even from your home high on the island. The serene, life-giving presence of the Nile that you have known your entire life has vanished. It is evolving into a more potent, possibly destructive force of nature that must be respected. Your dad stays up late making calculations and recalculations to determine when the water will peak. Together, you learn to decipher the patterns and the connection between the initial measurements and the final crest. It will be close, he finally admits. We may remain below 18 cubits if the climb slows tomorrow. He doesn't have to complete if not. You both understand its meaning. In addition to damaging houses and farmland, a flood that is more than 18 cubits in size poses a serious risk to Egypt's stability and food supply. Do we have no options? You inquire. Your father says we can pray, although we can get ready. The river will act as it pleases. Every Egyptian learns that lesson first. He gives you a contemplative glance. Tomorrow, I want to show you something. Something that very few people ever see. Your father wakes you up before dawn the following morning. Just come, he says. You follow him to a modest building situated back from the river, past the Nyormita, through the sleeping settlement. When your father opens the door, you see something completely different from what appears to be a storage shed. Hundreds of papyrus scrolls, neatly preserved in clay jars and wooden boxes, fill the one room. A tiny oil lamp that your father lights creates flickering shadows on the walls. This is the Nilometer archive, he explains in a respectfully low voice. More than 1,000 years' worth of records document the rise and collapse of the Niles. You gaze in wonder. 1,000 years. He gives a nod. Every day and measurement of every flood that the priests who came before us documented. This is how we learn to read the rhythms of the river and know what to anticipate. He gently unrolls a scroll he has chosen from one of the boxes. The hieroglyphics are worn but still readable, and the papyrus has turned yellow with age. This one documents the big flood that occurred more over 700 years ago during the reign of Pharaoh J. The maximum water level ever measured was 20 cubits. In Upper Egypt, half of the towns were destroyed. Admiring this link to the distant past, you look over the old inscription. These are the real footprints of a long-dead priest who documented a catastrophe that occurred centuries before you were born. And this is what I was searching for, your father continues, picking out another scroll. He unfolds the scroll to reveal columns of tidy hieroglyphics. The flood of your birth year, 19 cubits at its height. The majority of it is readable. Look here. He gestures to a particular section. Similar to today, the water rose swiftly initially before slowing down in Akhet's middle third. We were spared total catastrophe because of that. His eyes are reflecting the lamplight as he glances up at you. Although each flood is unique, they are all the same. The river peaks, falls, and rises. How fast it occurs and how high it rises are what count. Carefully, he rolls the scroll and puts it back in its box. Meriton, this is the real wisdom of Egypt. This is the meticulous documentation of the river's rhythms, year after year, generation after generation, not the opulent temples or the pyramids. We live this way. The eastern sky is starting to brighten as you exit the archive. The deluge is starting a new day. What is it going to bring? Will Egypt avoid catastrophe if the waves slow down or continue their swift descent? You can see boats traveling across what were fields only a few days ago in the fading light. Farmers have resorted to fishing as a way to augment their food sources during the flood. Children play and laugh while swimming in the shallower waters. Life changes. Egypt perseveres. As you both look out over the changed landscape, your father places his hand on your shoulder. Keep this in mind, Meriton, he murmurs. Both the giving and the taking of the Nile occur. Controlling it is not our responsibility. Nobody is capable of doing it. However, to comprehend it, quantify it, honor it, and assist others in doing the same. You nod as you observe the rivers changing from black to gold as the sunshine spreads across them. As Egyptians have traditionally dealt with the unpredictability of the Nile, you will face whatever comes your way in the days ahead. With planning, with solidarity, and with the belief that the land will be restored after each flood, no matter how damaging. As the morning wears on, the water keeps rising. It had grown to 16 cubits by midday, which is the right height for a successful harvest. However, it doesn't appear to be stopping. As the water gets stronger, it carries branches, pieces of wooden constructions, debris from upstream, and even an empty little boat that capsized. You are sent by your father to assist with the evacuation of a family that reside in a low-lying part of the island. Water is already entering their house. You help them move their sleeping mats, cooking utensils, clay pots, and a few other priceless items to a relative's home on higher ground. Senbi, the family's fisherman father, gives you a dried fish as a token of appreciation. For your assistance, he says plainly. He shares what little he has, even though he lost his house. This is Egypt as well, even in times of distress, generosity. The water level has increased to over 17 cubits by the time you return to the Nilometer in the evening. There are more people now, and they are tense and cautious. Everyone is aware that the distance of 18 cubits separates difficulties from catastrophe. When your father announces 16 cubits and 4 palms, you can see the tension in his face, yet he still takes the measurement with the same meticulous accuracy that he always displays. There's a murmur among the people. The flood has only just started, and we are already so close to the danger zone. You're unable to sleep that night. Your ears are filled with the sound of the river, and your mind is racing with pictures from the day. The flooded fields, the houses that were evacuated, and the expressions of those who were torn between dread and hope. You get off your sleeping mat and ascend to your home's roof. The flood waters appear to radiate an inner light in the moonlight. The altered terrain is both stunning and terrible, as it has since the time of the first pharaoh. The everlasting dance of land and water, destruction and creation is still going on. You'll measure the waters once more tomorrow. You will assist those in need tomorrow. You will continue studying the ancient knowledge of the Nyamita tomorrow. It is the science of surviving in a place where the rhythms of the river govern everything. For the moment, you observe the moonlight on the water and reflect on the precarious equilibrium of ancient Egyptian existence. A civilization based on the yearly flood of the Nile and its expected volatility. Little mudbrick houses and dirt pathways were all gone from the community of Huta 3 months ago. At this point, a vast lake extended beyond the horizon. The only parts of the community that were above the floodwaters were the tops of the tallest date palms and the village itself, which was thoughtfully constructed on a rise of ground. Nebet saw a small boat make its way through the altered environment from the edge of her family's house. The globe had become a glistening sea of water reflecting the clear blue sky, and the yearly flood had peaked. This was her favorite time of year, when everything changed totally, and the unthinkable happened in front of her eyes. In contrast to the nervous days when the waters first started to rise, there was a peculiar calm to the flooding now. Nebet took one final look at the river before turning and ducking through the low doorway as her mother's voice yelled from within the home, "Nebet, stop daydreaming and help me with this beer." In contrast to the scorching heat outside, the one-room house was cold within. The tiny, high windows let in some light, but not much direct heat, and the thick mud-brick walls blocked off the worst of the sun. Her mother was hunched over a big ceramic pot, using a wooden paddle to swirl a viscous mixture. The air was heavy with the distinct sour smell of rotting grain. "Here," T remarked, passing the paddle to Nebet. Beer brewing was a woman's job, and Nebet was expected to assist at the age of 12. "Keep stirring while I prepare the dates." Ancient Egyptian beer was rich, sweet, and nourishing, in contrast to the thin, bitter beer you may be familiar with. It's not so much a modern beverage as it is liquid bread. Everyone, from little children to elderly people, ate this main dish. Her mother explained that the dates would make it sweeter, but Nebet was already aware of this. "We must make this batch unique," Nebet asked, still stirring the viscous concoction, "for the Feast of Happy." T sliced dried dates with practiced efficiency and nodded. "The worst flood in a decade is worthy of our finest product. We are blessed by the Lord of the River." Indeed, this year's flooding had been extraordinary. There had been concern that it might be too much when the floods first started to rise. A devastating flood that would submerge the meticulously constructed irrigation systems and wash away houses. However, after rising gradually to just below the danger level, the floods leveled out. The entire hamlet thanked Happy, the deity of the Nile flood, every day for his goodness, since they were now 2/3 of the way through Akhet, the flood season. Through the doorway outside came the sounds of kids playing in the shallower water. Their world was drastically changed, but life continued. Several everyday activities were impossible during the flood season. The flooded fields were unusable for farming. The now undersea roads were unsuitable for long-distance travel, but other tasks went on and new chances presented themselves. Nak, Nebot's father, was taking full advantage of the water. This was his busiest period as a fisherman. He set nets from his little papyrus boat during the day, since there were plenty of fish in the enlarged waterways. Every evening he would come back with his catch, which Nebet and her mother would prepare for trading or storage by cleaning, salting, and drying. The fragrance of fish and river water followed him inside as the door covering rustled and squeaked. He'd spent so many days in the sun that his shoulders were deeply browned. His hands were rough from handling ropes and nets. Without raising her gaze from her task, Tay inquired, "A good day." "The flood has brought more fish than I've seen in years," Nak said, smiling, holding up a big net full of silver-keeled fish. In order to support the priests, officials, and eventually the divine pharaoh himself, the temple collected a tax from everyone's production, but this tax was not resented because it was perceived as a return to the gods who provided the flood, who in turn provided life itself. "Did they say anything about when the waters will begin to recede?" T asked, taking some of the fish and beginning to clean them with practiced movements. "The niometer at the temple shows the water has stopped rising," and said. "The priests say if the pattern follows previous years, we'll see the land begin to emerge in about 20 days. Nebot looked up from her stirring. 20 days until we can see our fields again." Her father nodded, and then the real work begins. Unlike the farmers who had little to do during the flood, Nebot knew her family would be busiest when the waters receded. As the flood withdrew, it would leave behind pools and channels teeming with trapped fish. Easy harvesting that required all hands working quickly before the hot sun dried the pools. But for now, Nak said, sitting down on a reed mat, "We prepare for the Feast of Happy. The whole village will gather tomorrow to give thanks for the perfect flood." The feast was the highlight of Akhet, a celebration of the life-giving inundation. Everyone in the village would contribute what they could. Beer, bread, fish, vegetables from the few garden plots on high ground that remained cultivable during the flood. There would be music, dancing, and offerings to Happy. As the sun began to set, Nebet climbed with her parents to the flat roof of their home. Many families in the village did the same each evening, seeking the cooler air and the spectacular view. From this vantage point, they could see the entire transformed landscape, the vast expanse of water dotted with the tops of palm trees and the islands that were once the highest points of the land. Small boats moved across the water, fishermen returning home or people visiting neighbors in nearby villages. In the distance, Nebet could make out the temple complex built on the highest ground and now surrounded by water like a fortress. "Look there," her father said, pointing to the western horizon where the sun was setting in a blaze of red and gold. "When the sun sets like that, so red it means Happy is pleased with our offerings." "And will the harvest be good?" Nebot asked, though she knew the answer. It was a ritual question, part of the reassurance they all sought during this time of waiting. "The best in years," her father confirmed. "The silt will be thick and black, perfect for planting. If Osiris is also generous, we'll have grain enough to last 2 years. Osiris, god of vegetation, the afterlife, and the cycle of death and rebirth, was closely linked with Happy in the minds of the Egyptians. The flood itself was sometimes said to be the tears of Isis mourning her husband, Osiris. The death and resurrection of Osiris paralleled the annual cycle of the Nile, the dry season when the land seemed dead, followed by the flood that brought rebirth and new growth. These were not abstract theological concepts to Nebet and her family. They were the practical reality of life in Egypt, where survival depended entirely on understanding and working with the river's cycles. As darkness fell, lamps were lit across the village. Small clay dishes of animal fat with reed wicks that cast a warm, flickering light. From rooftop to rooftop, neighbors called greetings and shared news. Despite the isolation created by the flood, community remained strong. Nacked, Will you bring that big Nile fish to the feast tomorrow? These evening gatherings were a special feature of the flood season, a voice from a nearby roof said. If my wife leaves me any to bring, Neked called back, and laughter echoed across the darkening rooftops. Everyone was too preoccupied with fieldwork to mingle much after dark for the remainder of the year. Akit, however, added a new beat. Fishing in the morning, cooking and crafting in the sweltering day, and socializing as a community in the evening. Families eventually started returning to their houses for the night as the stars came out in all their glory, unabated by any artificial light. Nebet stayed a while longer, watching the floodwaters transform to silver as the moon rose above them. The feast was scheduled for tomorrow, but she was even more excited about what would arrive the day following. It was her turn to go to the far-off market with her older brother, Amon Het. Regular market days in the village plaza were difficult during the flood. Rather, at key locations where boats from various villages might congregate to exchange goods, floating markets were set up. These marketplaces were essential for the exchange of news as well as commerce. The most recent information about political events in the city, flood levels upstream, or possible dangers from desert nomads spread via word of mouth from hamlet to village in a world without quick communication. Nebet assisted her mother in cooking a basic dinner inside their house, a mixture of ground beans, bread that had been baked earlier in the day, and dried fish that had been softened in broth. They used slices of bread to scrape up their food while they sat on reed mats. Plates and utensils as we know them were absent. After supper, Neabet's mother used a basic drop spindle to spin flax into thread as her father repaired his fishing nets under the dark light of a solitary oil lamp. Using a little loom, Neabet practiced weaving, a skill that was expected of all Egyptian girls. As she worked the weft thread through the warp with her fingers, Nebot said, "Tell us a story, father." In the village, Nakt was well known for his tales. He was illiterate, but scribes and priests were the only ones who could read and write. He possessed a remarkable recall and a style of writing that brought his stories to life. As his hands continued their rehearsed motions with the net, he inquired, "What story would you like?" "Tell about the time before the Neometer, when no one knew if the flood would be good or bad," Nebet asked for. She thought some of it was more legend than history, but it was still one of her favorites. Nakt grinned. An excellent option for the eve of the happy feast. He cleared his throat and started recounting stories in his rhythmic manner. Every year, the people of the Nile lived in terror as Akit drew closer, long before the first monarchs brought the two lands together and before the first stone was set for any temple. Because they lacked a priest to interpret the signs, a neometer to measure the water, and records of previous years to instruct them. His voice fell sharply. It was a mystery every year. Would Happy bring destruction or water that could save lives? Would the fields stay dry and arid, or would they be fed with rich silt? Before the seas arrived, nobody knew. Even though Nebet had heard the story countless times, her hands remained motionless on her weaving as she listened. A wise woman named Nekbet lived in a village similar to ours back then. She observed the river more intently than anybody else, taking note of the crocodile's nest-moving patterns, the waterbirds' pre-flood behavior, and the way the air itself changed in scent as it got closer. Nekbet saw and recalled year after year. She gathered her village's residents when she was quite elderly and shared what she had discovered with them. Just before the sun, keep an eye out for the bright star Sus rising. The flood will arrive in 5 days when you see it. Observe the hue of the initial floodwaters. The flood will be high if they are really red. It will be lower if they are more brown. After listening to Nekbet, the folks discovered that her signs were accurate. By raising their dwellings higher when a major flood was imminent and excavating deeper irrigation canals when a low flood was anticipated, they started to prepare for each flood in accordance with the indicators. Up and down the river, people began to hear of Nekbet's wisdom. Soon there were watchers in every village who looked at the signs. In order to measure exactly what Nekhbet had taught the populace to notice, the priests constructed the Nilometers, stone stairs that descended into the river marked with cubits and palms, when Egypt's first kings united it and the first temples were constructed. Nak's voice was normal again, for this reason, just as our predecessors did before the invention of the Nilometer. We still keep an eye out for the star Sirius and note the color of the first floodwaters. Nebot grinned. She loved how the story linked her to generations who had depended on the same flood, lived by the same river, and saw the same cycles. "Is the story true, Father?" she inquired, participating in the ritual, even though she knew the answer. As usual, he responded that there is truth in every story. The indicators she taught are authentic, regardless of whether Nekhbet was the collective knowledge of numerous women or just one. Together with the neometer, we still use them today. The family got ready for bed as the lamp went down. There were just red mats spread out on the compacted earth floor in place of beds as we know them. Since the air was cooler on the roof, many people opted to sleep there on the hottest evenings, like tonight. Nebot spread her sleeping mat out under the starry sky after carrying it to the roof. Other families were following suit throughout the village. Though still warm, the air was far more comfortable than it was inside the house. Nibet contemplated the feast tomorrow as she lay gazing up at the stars. She would dress in the finest linen gown her family could afford, which was modest by our standards. There would be dancing, a ton of food, and music played on drum and flutes. To thank Happy for the ideal flood, the entire community would congregate in the temple courtyard, which was the highest point on the property. She must have dreamed of dancing to flute music while the Nile rivers sparkled beneath her feet, suggesting that the feast had followed her into slumber. The river deity himself emerged from the waters in her dream. Just like he was in the temple paintings, he had a blue skin, a pot belly, and pendulous breeze capped with papyrus plants. In her dream, the god stated, "Happy blesses those who respect the river. Keep this small one in mind." The sounds of the village coming to life greeted her as the sun rose. Birds singing, voices calling, and the sound of boats launching for early morning fishing. There was a lot to get ready for today's feast of happiness. Her mother was up early, completing the special beer they would be bringing to the feast. It was richly sweet from the dates, and their tiny house was filled with the scent. Tai yelled, "Come, help me strain this," and Nebet rushed to help. Together, they filled big clay jars that would be transported to the temple with the viscous liquid and filtered it through a fine mesh cloth. Her father had brought in his early morning catch in the meantime. Additional fish should be swiftly cleaned and prepared for the feast. There would be no waste. The garden plots would even be fertilized with the end rails. As he handed over his catch, Nak said, "The entire village is getting ready. Never before have I seen so many boats out at such an early hour. For the feast, everyone wants to bring something unique." By the middle of the morning, everything was ready. Nebet put on her feast attire, a plain white linen shift that her mother had stitched and woven. Before she joined Osiris in the afterlife, she wore a single strand of blue fance beads, which were her grandmother's most prized gift to her. The family filled their little boat with their donations, including baskets of grilled fish, jars of beer, and fresh bread. As they joined a group of boats carrying similar loads, Naked dragged them through the inundated village and towards the temple complex. Compared to the huge temples in the cities, Happy's temple was not as imposing. Despite being a straightforward building made of stone and mud brick, it served as the center of village life, particularly during the flood. Even during the worst floods, it stayed totally dry because it was built on the highest ground. Nabet could hear the music starting as they got closer, the steady pounding of drums made from stretched animal skin and ceramics, and the eerie sound of reed flutes. Villagers in their finest attire were lining up in the temple courtyard, each carrying wood and beverages to share. As is customary for significant events, the priests stood at the entrance wearing white linen with leopard skins draped over their shoulders. They gave formal blessings to each family that accepted contributions. As he gave their offerings, the head EP said, "May God continue to bless your nets. May Osiris bring plenty when the waters subside, and may Isis sweeten your beer." Long reed mats had been spread out for seating inside the courtyard. A statue of happiness stood in the middle. It was not big or composed of priceless materials, but it was respectfully carved from local stone and painted in vibrant hues. In order to represent the fertility and abundance he delivered, the god was portrayed with breasts, a round belly, and blue skin. The sign of Lower Egypt, papyrus plants, was placed on his head. For the feast, the statue had been carefully decorated. Offering dishes of bread, beer, and fish were set at his feet, and garlands of flowers hung around his neck. The headman of the hamlet got up to speak to the assembled populace. He was in charge of civil administration and collaborated closely with the temple authorities, despite not being a priest. He started, "People of Huterib," his voice echoing around the courtyard. "We gather today to give thanks to Mighty Happy, Lord of the Flood, for his perfect inundation. The Niometer shows 17 cubits, abundance without destruction. When the waters recede, our fields will be rich with silt, ready for the greatest harvest in a decade." A cheer went up from the crowd. 17 cubits was indeed perfect, high enough to cover all the farmland with water and silt, but not so high as to threaten the village itself. "Before we feast, let us give proper thanks," the headman kept going. The head priest came forward to conduct the ceremony. A religious ritual and a communal celebration ensued. Like an English speaker attempting to follow Shakespeare, the priest's old and sometimes challenging to understand language were used in his formal prayers. However, everyone was aware of the overall idea and knew when to use the conventional phrases in response. "To the cheerful one who rises from the dirt to feed Egypt, hail." The villagers reacted in unison as the priest said, "We give thanks for your blessing." Before the statue, the priest poured a libation of beer, allowing it to spill onto the floor. The offering of bread and fish was then ceremoniously put in front of the statue as the priest repeated additional prayers. "Drink happy that you may continue to feed us with your waters." The ceremony's official portion came to an end and the banquet started. Everyone in attendance received food and beverages from temple servants. Social differences persisted. Ordinary farmers, fishermen, and craftspeople sat farther away from the statue, while the village aristocracy sat closest to it. But the richness was shared by everybody. Now that the musicians were playing more upbeat music, some people started dancing. The courtyard's open areas were used by kids for activities and running. The mood was one of sincere gratitude and happiness. Naboth sat and savored the wonderful feast items with her family. Vegetables cultivated in the temple gardens that survived the flood, bread baked with honey, and fish cooked with uncommon seasonings. Beer was easily available, but it was not at all like the alcohol of today. It was still mildly fermented, but more nourishing than intoxicating. As the feast went on, she saw the headman greeting a group of strangers. The boat they had come in was bigger than any in the village. Downriver traders bringing commodities and news from the wider world. During Aket, these traders were frequently seen. The flood season was the ideal time for business because regular farming operations were halted. Boats were limited to the river main and the canals during the dry season, although they were able to proceed directly over the floodplain and avoid taking any shortcuts. "They've come from Memphis," an enthusiastic whisper went around. Naboth observed as the traders gave the headmen and priests presents of upscale city goods that would have been out of reach for regular villages. Memphis, the ancient capital near modern Cairo, was a major city that most villagers would never see in their lifetime. News from such a place was precious. In exchange, they would receive hospitality and have the chance to conduct business with the locals in the days after the feast. Tomorrow, these traders will set up shop in the floating market, which she was eager to see. Maybe their eyes were lined with the beautiful black coal that rich women wore, or they had beads like hers. The terrain was altered after the floodwaters subsided. Only weeks ago, the area had been a huge lake, but now it was a patchwork of gleaming wet mud and lingering pools. Everything was covered with a layer of fertility from the rich black silt that was left behind after the flood in Kemet, the black country that gave Egypt its name. Like thousands of other men throughout Egypt, Parton Marut mended his sore back and dabbed at his perspiration. He had been called up to do the most crucial task for the late Eti, reconstructing and mending the irrigation canals before the waters totally dried up. Men were digging channels through the soft mud all around him with reed baskets and wooden hoes. The soggy ground became a steamy sauna as the sun ruthlessly pounded down. Nevertheless, there was a sense of purpose and even camaraderie among the workers, despite the heat and the taxing labor. Everyone knew what was at risk. The marvel of the Nile's abundance would be squandered if they were unable to appropriately channel the retreating floodwaters. "Put your back into it, farmer," Amenopi, a local official who was carrying a thin stick as a sign of authority, called the supervisor. "Lazy men won't get the water." Parton Marut made no attempt to answer. He was 42 years old, older than the majority of the workers, and had experienced enough floods to understand the cadence of this labor. Like the heat, the mud, and the sore muscles, the overseer's bluster was but a part of the process. In order to create a new segment of the canal that would supply water to the farms in his community, he sank his wooden hoe back into the dirt. This job was mandatory. For a set number of days a year, every physically fit male had to work in the Corv labor system. Their contribution to the community and, eventually, to the heavenly pharaoh himself was their tax. Parton Marut worked as a farmer, caring for his crops of flax and barley for the majority of the year. However, he turned into a canal digger in late Akkad. He was useful to the canal construction effort because he knew the country, where the soil was richest and where it was more sandy, and which places stored water and which drained rapidly. Someone cried from farther up the canal, "Water's coming!" After straightening up, the men observed a minor surge of water flowing down the channel they had been excavating. The muddy water moved smoothly through the new section, gaining speed as it reached the precisely measured slope. This was the moment of truth. Would their work hold? Would the water follow the path they'd created? The employees gave a cheer. This canal system branch was operating as intended. Amenopi gave a contented nod. Excellent. Moving on to the secondary channel is now possible. Get your tools and come with me. Leaving the now flowing canal behind, the men gathered their crude tools and trudged after the supervisor. They were walking along when Parton Marut found himself next to User Hate, a younger man from the village next door. Adjusting the wooden hoe on his shoulder, User Hate inquired, "How many more days of service do you have?" "3 more after today," said Parton Marut. The user glanced about at the massive project that was under progress throughout the floodplain and said, "And you?" "5. It's my first year with full service obligations." I had no idea the canals required so much maintenance. Parton gave a nod. Until they do their time, the majority don't. Without this, however, he pointed to the intricate system of channels being excavated throughout the terrain. We refused to eat. The real wonder of Egyptian civilization was the canal system. In some ways, it is more spectacular than the pyramids and temples. This entire infrastructure had to be rebuilt every year following the flood. From large arteries that could support boats to microscopic capillaries that supplied water to specific fields, there were thousands of kilometers of canals. In the absence of this system, the floodwaters would just return to the river, drying out the majority of the land in a matter of weeks. It allowed farmers to precisely regulate the amount and timing of water that reached their fields, extending the growing season and increasing harvests. "Here," Amenup replied, pausing at an unmarked mud spot that matched the surrounding terrain exactly. From here, the secondary channel extends to the distant palms. How was he aware? There were no obvious indicators that a canal had ever been in this area. Parton Marut, however, knew the solution. A papyrus scroll was in the overseer's possession. This district's canal map was made and kept up to date by scribes over many centuries. Each channel was captured with its exact dimensions and orientation specified. The men resumed their work, following Amenope's instructions to dig a new canal. The overseer paced back and forth, checking the depth and breadth of the excavation with a measuring cord and occasionally studying his scroll. The construction of canals was a precise science. It had to be the perfect slope. If it were too steep, the banks would be eroded by the water's rapid flow. If it were too shallow, it would stagnate and provide insects that spread disease with a place to reproduce. The system as a whole had to cooperate, with primary channels feeding minor ones, which in turn fed the tiniest field ditches, and the breadth and depth had to correspond with the anticipated flow of water. The heat was nearly intolerable by midday. The workers took a short break and gathered beneath a group of date palms for what little shade they could find. They consumed a basic diet of bread and onions and drank water from clay jars. One young guy exclaimed, his eyes open, "Is that possible?" Parton Marut told us and a few of the other younger men when I was a youngster, "My father told me that in the old days they used to divert entire branches of the Nile to create new farmland." With sufficient personnel and the appropriate information, Parton Marut nodded. The previous rulers did it indeed. By altering the river's path, they transformed the desert into farmland. Is it possible for us to achieve it right now? Userhead pondered. Maybe if the Pharaoh of heaven ordered it. Making sure that the water from this flood reaches every field that is currently there before it is lost to the sea is our more modest duty. The work continued after the short break. A fresh obstacle arose in the afternoon, a patch of less cooperative ground that was more sandy than silty. The canal walls here continued to collapse as soon as they were excavated. Amenope conferred with Parton Marut and other senior employees. The overseer determined that this part needed to be strengthened. Bring mud blocks and palm fronds. This was a typical fix for areas that were unstable. Before being coated with a layer of mud bricks, the palm fronds would be woven into mats and used to line the canal walls. To make sure the canal would last through the planting season, it was more labor-intensive than just excavating through good soil. Amenope finally halted the day's work as the sun started to set on the western horizon. The men were muddy from head to toe and were worn out. After gathering their equipment, they set off to return to respective villages on foot. Even though Parton Marut was exhausted, he was satisfied. The work was going smoothly. They would finish this portion of the canal system in the allocated time if the weather held and no unforeseen issues emerged. The surroundings were a flurry of similar activity as they strolled. Teams of men were strengthening banks, excavating channels, and building minor dams to regulate the water flow in all directions. Tens of thousands of laborers from all throughout Egypt participated in this enormously coordinated endeavor. "Look there," Parton Marut told Usuza, gesturing to a group of people working on a much bigger canal in the distance. "Those are the royal engineers. The reservoirs that held water during the dry months, the levees that guarded towns, the main canals that supplied entire regions, and the most significant waterworks were all planned and overseen by this exclusive group of experts. They were paid from the royal treasury and worked year-round, unlike the local corps of laborers. What is the process for becoming a royal engineer?" Observing the far-off figures with curiosity, the user asked. "You have to become a scribe first," Partnut said. "Learning to read and write in order to compute and measure took years of study. You may then be chosen for water management courses if you demonstrate talent. It's a route for people with extraordinary talent or connections." User H gave a contemplative nod. "The son of my sister has been selected to train as a scribe. Maybe someday. It's a wise route." Parton Marut concurred. "Digging canals is not something that scribes do for a living. At a fork in the road, they split up, each going to his own village. The sun had already fallen as Partinut arrived home, illuminating the surroundings in shades of scarlet and gold. His community was situated on somewhat lower ground than the one we saw during the worst of the flood. The villagers had moved to makeshift shelters on higher ground during the flood. They had now returned to their permanent residences as the floodwaters had subsided, and they were working to restore any damage the extended submersion had caused. After being submerged for weeks, mud brick dwellings need a lot of renovation. To avoid mold, flooring had to be resurfaced, walls had to be fixed, and everything needed to dry completely. The scent of damp ground and the dung fires used to hasten the drying process filled the entire village. Hen Mit, Patten Marut's wife, had a steaming hot lunch ready for him. Fresh bread made in a clay oven with chunks of salty fish and a hearty lentil stew. He sat on a reed mat to eat after cleaning the worst of the dirt in a bucket of water. Henut Mahit offered him a cup of beer to wash down the food and inquired, "How goes the canal work?" "Well enough," he said in between gulping down food. "The secondary channels should be finished in 3 more days. After that, we'll return to our own fields." Their 2 sons and a daughter joined them for dinner. At the ages of 16 and 14, the boys were already collaborating alongside the men on the canal project. The 9-year-old girl assisted her mother with housework and caring for their little garden plot, which had survived the flood because of its elevated location. The older son mentioned his younger sibling and remarked, "Today, Naktank learnt something interesting from the Royal Engineers." "Oh." Partonut gave his younger son a curious glance. The child gave an enthusiastic nod. To ensure that the canals are level, they employ a device known as a merket. They utilize it in conjunction with water to determine the actual level, much like a plumb line. Marut Parton grinned. Tools and the workings of things have always captivated his younger kid. Such tools are widely available to the Royal Engineers. Because of this, they are able to construct canals that endure for many years rather than just one season. Parton Marut walked around the village after the lunch, even though he was exhausted. He had duties outside of his own home as a revered elder. He stopped to talk to the village headman about the canal's development, made sure a recent widow got assistance fixing her roof, and visited an elderly neighbor whose son was abroad in the army. Concerned was the headman, a burly man named Mahu, who acted as the liaison between the village and the district authorities. When he told Patten Mute, "The overseer says we're behind schedule. If the channels aren't ready when the last flood waters recede, we'll lose precious growing time. We've faced worse." Patten Marut informed him, "Remember the year of the Great Flood, when half the dikes washed away? We still managed to plant before pay was half over." Pereit, the growing season, followed Aket in the Egyptian calendar. It was the time when crops were sown and tended, lasting roughly from November to February. After Parade came Shemu, the harvest season from March to June. Then the cycle would begin again with the next flood. "True," Mahu acknowledged, "but the district governor is pressing for faster progress. He has quotas to meet, grain projections to fulfill." "We'll manage, Patten," Mu said with the confidence of long experience. "The young men are strong, if inexperienced. With proper guidance, they'll learn quickly." This was another of his unofficial roles, reassuring the headman who bore the weight of responsibility for the village's productivity if the harvest failed to meet the expected yield. It was Mahu who would face the district governor's displeasure. By the time Patten Marut returned home, night had fallen completely. Inside his house, a small oil lamp provided the only light, a simple clay dish filled with animal fat with a reed wick. His family was preparing for sleep, spreading reed mats on the packed earth floor. There was no privacy as we would understand it. The entire family slept in the same room, parents and children together. This was normal in Egyptian village homes, which typically consisted of just 1 or 2 rooms, plus a small courtyard. Despite his exhaustion, Parton Marut found it hard to fall asleep. His back ached from the day's labor, and his mind was busy with calculations and concerns. How much seed would they need for planting? Would the barley field, which had yielded poorly last year, do better with the rich new silt? Should they plant more flax this year, given the high prices textile merchants had been paying? These were the thoughts that occupied a farmer's mind during late Ayed planning for the growing season to come, making decisions that would determine his family's prosperity for the entire year. Beside him, Hen Mahit stirred. "You're not sleeping," she observed quietly. "Too many thoughts," he admitted. "About the canals, about everything, the canals, the planting, the children," he sighed. Nakt Enk is showing interest in the engineer's work. Perhaps he could train as a scribe. Hen Mahit was silent for a moment. That would be a better life for him. Easier on the body, if not the mind. Patan Marut nodded in the darkness. Every parent hoped their children might rise to a higher station, escape the endless cycle of physical labor that defined a farmer's existence. But scribe training was expensive and required connections. It would mean sacrifices for the whole family. "We'll see," he said finally. "For now, we focus on this season, one flood at a time, as my father used to say." He felt his wife's hand find his in the darkness, a small gesture of solidarity and comfort. Together they had weathered many floods, many plantings, many harvests. Whatever challenges this year brought, they would face them as they always had. The next morning came too soon, the first light of dawn filtering through the small windows high in the walls. Already the village was stirring, voices calling, chickens clucking, the smell of bread baking in communal ovens. Another day of canal work awaited, but first came morning rituals. Patan Marut washed in a basin of precious, clean water. Water was used sparingly for bathing, with most of it reserved for drinking and cooking. He ate a quick breakfast of bread dipped in bean paste, then gathered his tools. His sons joined him, and together they walked to the meeting point where the labor crews were assembled each morning. The overseer, Amanop, was already there. Papyrus, scroll in hand, calling out assignments. North section crew continue the secondary channel from yesterday, he ordered. South section begin the field channels for the barley lands. East section reinforce the main canal bank where it's showing weakness. Patan Marut and his sons were assigned to the east section along with Userhead and several other men from neighboring villages. The main canal was the most critical part of the system. If it failed, all the secondary channels would be useless. They walked to their assigned section where the problem was immediately apparent. A section of the canal bank was slumping, the mud sliding back into the channel. If it continued, it could block the water flow or even cause a breach that would flood areas not meant to receive water yet. "We need to rebuild this section completely," said the crew leader, an experienced canal worker named Paheri. "Remove all the soft mud, then rebuild with alternating layers of stiff clay and plant fiber." This was more complex work than simple digging. It required knowledge of materials and construction techniques. Patan Marut, with his years of experience, was put in charge of a small team including his sons and Userhead. "First, we scrape away all this loose material," he instructed in day. "Get down to firm soil. Then we'll lay the reinforcement." The younger men set to work with enthusiasm, if not always with skill. Patan Marut corrected them gently, showing them how to test the firmness of the soil, how to shape the bank at the proper angle. "Not so steep," he told his younger son, who was forming the new bank. "If it's too steep, it will just slump again when it gets wet. A gentle slope is stronger." As the morning progressed, their section of rebuilt bank took shape. Plant fibers, mainly straw and palm fronds, were layered with clay to create a strong, flexible structure that could withstand the pressure of water. This was ancient technology, used since the earliest days of Egyptian civilization, but still effective. Around midday, an unexpected visitor arrived at the work site. A scribe, identifiable by his clean white kilt and the writing kit he carried, a wooden palette with depressions for black and red ink, and reed pens tucked behind his ear. He was accompanied by 2 soldiers, their bronze-tipped spears glinting in the sunlight. The workers straightened, wiping sweat from their faces. A visit from a royal scribe was unusual and potentially concerning. Was there a problem with their work? Had someone complained to the district officials? Amanopi hurried over to greet the scribe, bowing respectfully. They spoke in low voices, with the overseer gesturing toward the canal works in progress. Then, to everyone's surprise, Amanop turned and pointed directly at Parton Marit. "You there, Parton Mo. Come here," the overseer called, with a confused glance at his sons. Parton Mirut set down his tools and approached the officials. He bowed to the scribe, keeping his eyes lowered as was proper when addressing a superior. "This is the man I mentioned," Amanipi said to the scribe. "He has worked on the canals for over 30 years and knows this district's water system better than anyone." The scribe looked Parton Marut over with an appraising eye. "You understand canal construction?" he asked. "I know what works and what doesn't in our soil, honored one." Parton Marut replied cautiously, "I've seen many floods come and go." The scribe nodded. "Good. The Royal Engineers are facing a challenge with the new reservoir project north of here. Your district is comparable to the dirt. To provide them advice on local conditions, they need men with experience." The reservoir project and the Royal Engineers were not in Parton Marit's heart. His typical corps of service was far from this. The scribe went on, "I have been given permission by the district governor to enlist 10 men who possess the necessary expertise. You've been suggested. For time beyond your corps of duty, you will receive payment. It was, of course, a concern as well as an honor. He might have to leave his village for weeks in order to work with the Royal Engineers. Soon, his own fields will require maintenance. However, the money may have a big impact on his family's financial situation, and the skills he could learn from working with the top water engineers in the kingdom could help his town as a whole. Serving the great pharaoh in whatever way is an honor for me." Parton Marit stated that any devoted topic would be obliged to respond formally. On his papyrus, the scribe wrote something. "Excellent. Tomorrow morning, report to the reservoir site. Bring any tools you think may be helpful." Parton Marit was left standing in startled stillness as the journalist and his escorts left. All around him, the other employees muttered in astonishment and conjecture. With wide eyes, the user hat remarked, "The reservoir project. They claim that once the flood subsides, it will retain water for an entire season. It is unlike anything built in generations." Parton Marit gave a sluggish nod, still taking in this surprising development. The district was talking about the reservoir. The Heavenly Pharaoh himself authorized a huge engineering project to extend the growing season and boost agricultural output. Every farmer in the area would see a significant change in their lives if it was successful. And now he would be involved in some way. Hakuit's fields have changed once more. There was a patchwork of meticulously prepared plots, dark with rich Nile silt, waiting for seed. This area had been a huge lake during Akhet, and a mud-covered plain during canal construction. The most optimistic period of the Egyptian calendar, known as planting season, began with the end of Akhet and the start of Per. The promise of fresh growth and the continuance of life's never-ending cycle followed the devastation and rejuvenation caused by the flood. Still wet from the drained floodwaters, Kensit stood at the edge of her family's main field, her bare toes curling into the dirt. Even though she had witnessed this change numerous times by the age of 35, it always left her feeling awestruck. It was all made possible by the gift of this fertile black earth from the Nile. From where he was struggling with their wooden plow and hesitant ox, her husband Senbi cried out, "Are you going to stand there all day, or help with the plowing?" Kensit approached him with a smile. In contrast to more affluent farmers who kept multiple oxmen, they just had this one elderly animal that had been saved for years. Even working with this obstinate beast seemed like a blessing because they had previously dragged the plow manually, which was back-breaking labor. Senbi grumbled, straining to maintain a straight furrow in the soil with the wooden blade of the plow. He's not happy today. Kensit approached the ox's head and stroked its snout while using calming voices. Old one, come. You can rest in a few more hours. As Senbi maneuvered the plow, the animal appeared to react to her touch and began to pull more steadily. Their beat was this, developed within the course of 15 years of farming and marriage. He was strong enough to push the plow. She was patient enough to handle the kids and animals. The typical Egyptian unit of land measurement, 1.5 AAS, is about equal to 1 acre, hence their field was not very huge. However, it belonged to them and was passed down from Senbi's father. And with proper management, it produced enough to feed their family and leave a little extra to exchange for things they couldn't make on their own. The voices of youngsters came from the other side of the pitch. Kensit thought that their 3 youngest children, 2 boys and a girl, had discovered a puddle to play in instead of cleaning up the remaining flood-related debris from the field boundaries, based on their laughter and splashing. Aman Hat, their eldest son, was not present with the smaller kids. He was regarded as a man with adult duties at the age of 16. To retrieve their planting grain, barley and emmer wheat, which had been meticulously stored from the previous year's harvest, he had been dispatched to the local seed storage. The seeds were valuable. The best part of each spring's produce was saved for planting the following year. In order to keep the grain dry and rodent-free, the village kept a common seed storage in a raised-floored mud-brick building with thick walls. When the fields were prepared for planting, the community scribe documented each family's seed allocation and distributed them. Kensit looked about at the busy activity across the floodplain as they worked their way across the field, periodically straightening to relax her back. While the soil was still at the ideal consistency for planting, all the families were working on the same pressing tasks, preparing fields. If the soil is too dry, it will be difficult to deal with, and if it is too moist, the seeds may rot. Look, she said to Senbi, indicating a nearby field where a more affluent farmer was in charge of a number of staff using 2 plows. Ipua has new bronze-tipped plows. Senbi looked up for a moment, then went back to work. Those with more silver than common sense should use bronze plows. If you maintain wood sharp, it functions fairly well. Although his tone was light, Kensit was aware of the truth in it. They could not afford bronze tools. They used wood, stone, and sometimes copper for minor tools, just like the majority of farmers. Senbi utilized the same type of wooden plow that Egyptian farmers had been using for thousands of years. A basic share that was fastened to poles that controlled its direction and depth. The plow turned the rich soil in preparation for seeding, demonstrating its effectiveness despite its simplicity. The majority of the labor had already been completed by the flood, which had deposited a new layer of fertile silt and softened the ground. The Nile provided Egyptian farmers with a free annual application of nature's finest fertilizer, unlike farmers in other regions who had to apply dung or other fertilizers to their fields. Dad, Mum, look who's coming. Nefitari, their youngest daughter, ran across the pitch with delight in her dark eyes. Amon Hat trailed more placidly behind her, a big basket slung across his shoulder. Patan Marot, the esteemed elder who had been enlisted to assist the Royal Engineers with the reservoir project, unexpectedly appeared beside him. As the guests drew closer, Senbi halted the plow to allow the ox to rest. Kensit smoothed her plain linen outfit and removed dirt from her hands. Patan Marot honors our field, Senbi remarked, holding his head up to the elder with deference. The older guy grinned, crinkling the corners of his eyes, and asked, "What brings you to our humble plot when the Royal Engineers surely need your wisdom?" Although the reservoir project continues, I was allowed 2 days to take care of personal matters. I decided to go on a walk with your son after spotting him at the seed storage. I haven't examined the fields in this area of our district in much too long. It was a courteous work of fiction. Everybody was aware that Parton Marot was visiting the village fields and imparting the knowledge he had gained from the Royal Engineers. More precious than any tangible item he might have contributed, his knowledge was a gift to the community. Their planting seed for this season was the golden brown grain that was visible when a Menem hat put down his basket. With each planting, Kenset experienced the same mixture of fear and hope. Their future was symbolized by those tiny, stony kernels. The family would eat them if they germinated and flourished. Otherwise, she dismissed the idea. "I've learnt a new seed preparation technique from the engineers." While kneeling next to the hoop, Parton Marot spoke. "Before planting, they soak it for a night in river water that has been diluted with natron. They say it discourages bugs and speeds up the seed's germination." Natron, a naturally occurring mineral salt that was extracted from dry lake beds, was utilized for a variety of purposes, including tooth cleaning and mummy preservation. The notion that it could benefit crops was novel, at least to Hessinuit farmers. "Is it effective?" Senby inquired, pragmatic as usual. Parton Marot retorted, "The royal fields show promising results." "To share, I've brought a little natron. If you want to try." He pulled a linen pouch from his belt that would hold enough of your seed. This was a kind present. Natron was not rare, but it needed to be exchanged, and Parton Marot was giving up information and resources that he could have retained for his own fields. Kensit declared, "We are grateful," and took the pouch. Her eyes shifted to her oldest son. "Tonight, Aminemam Hut, locate a sanitized pot to immerse the seed in." The youngster gave a nod and rushed towards their house, a modest mud-brick building that could be seen in the distance, where the farmed fields gave way to the somewhat elevated hamlet proper. Parton Marot lingered to talk with Senby about the water distribution and canal system. The two men strolled around the field's edges, inspecting the tiny irrigation pipes that would supply this particular plot with water from the bigger canals. According to Parton Marot, the new reservoir will alter our irrigating strategy. We will have access to water later in the agricultural season rather than relying solely on the flood. "Who will be in charge of this water?" Sini inquired. "The same officials who oversee the canals," Parton Marot said in response to the query that worried the farmers. Kenset listened as he carried on with his task. "But with more consistent water throughout the year, there will be less competition for it during critical times." She was more concerned with the practicality of planting their crops on schedule than with the politics of water. To assist prepare the remaining portion of the field, she summoned her younger children over and demonstrated how to use a wooden hose to break up earthen clouds. Parton Marot eventually left, going to the next farm to impart his wisdom. The family settled into the routine of their labor as Senby went back to the plow. The children removing trash, Kensit using a wooden rake to level the plowed dirt, and the steady motion of the ox and plow. The sun was hot and high at midday. The deluge had brought with it a temporary period of lower temperatures. The unrelenting heat of Egypt had returned. In order to rest and eat a midday meal during the hottest part of the day, the family moved to a small shelter at the side of the field, which was only a modest roof, made of palm fronds held up by 4 poles. Aminem Hat had brought back a clay jar of water, bread, dried fish, a few onions, and food from the house. They were famished from the morning's labor and ate in friendly solitude. One of the younger boys, Juti, who was only 8 years old and still learning about the agricultural cycle, was asked, "Tomorrow we plant." Senby affirmed that we will sow the barley tomorrow. For another 2 days, the wheat will wait. Planting was often done in stages, distributing the risk and the labor. It was preferable to avoid having all crops at the same susceptible stage in case of disease, pests, or an unforeseen dry spell. They took a short break and went back to work. Final preparations, irrigation channel inspection, final debris removal, and boundary marker installation took up the day. The boundaries of their land were marked with stone markers bearing the family's name. an essential safety measure in a region where yearly flooding may obliterate apparent borders. The family gathered their tools, including the plow, hose, and rake, and started walking back to their village house as Senbi finally declared the day's work to be over as the sun started to set towards the western horizon. Kennet observed her husband examining the wooden plow with a trained hand to look for wear or damage that would need to be fixed before tomorrow. The tool was basic but necessary. A curved piece of acacia wood with handles that stretch up and back to allow the plowman to guide it, and a little harder wood at the tip. No complicated machinery, no metal, but for thousands of years it had been a useful tool for Egyptian farmers. Like most houses in the village, theirs was a plain rectangular mud brick building with a flat roof. In addition to a modest storage space and a courtyard where most everyday activities occurred, the main room served as the family's space for cooking, eating, and sleeping. It might appear small and bare in comparison to our contemporary dwellings, but by Egyptian peasant farmers' standards, it was more than sufficient. Preparations for the planting the following day were already underway in the courtyard. As instructed by Patan Marat, Amon Hat had prepared a sizable ceramic vase with Nile water. Under Kensit's supervision, he gradually added some of the powder and stirred until it dissolved. She said, "Now the seed," and they all poured in the barley from the basket, making sure that every grain was completely submerged. Kensit shrugged a little when Aminamam Hat said, "How does it work?" Curious as always about the reasons behind things. According to Patan Marut, it speeds up the seed's germination. Maybe the natron awakens the dormant plant within every grain. Although it was stated in language that a farmer from the Bronze Age might comprehend, this was not far from the reality. It's possible that the natron, a mixture of sodium chemicals, will soften the seed coat and keep some fungus and pests away. Inside their house, Senbi's youngest daughter was using a saddle quer, a concave stone foundation, and a smaller stone to grind grain for the evening meal. It was laborious and slow, but necessary. Every day, each household grinds their own grain. The basis of all meals was bread. There was no kitchen as we know it in the house. Cooking was done over an open fire in the courtyard or in a tiny mud brick oven for bread. There were baskets for clothes and personal belongings, a few wooden stools, clay storage jars, and a few reed mats for sitting and sleeping in the main chamber. Nevertheless, the house felt full of purpose and familial ties in spite of its material simplicity. As they assisted with evening chores, the kids talked about their day. In order to impart knowledge that had been passed down through the years, Senbi talked with his oldest son about planting techniques. With the subdued authority of a mother who understood precisely what had to be done and when, Kensit oversaw everything. The family got together for dinner as night fell. Beer, lentil stew with a few priceless pieces of dried fish and fresh bread. The beer was nourishing and only slightly alcoholic, more like a liquid nourishment than an intoxicant, like the majority of Egyptian beers. Though diluted, even the kids drank it. The last preparations for the planting the following day came after the lunch. It was necessary to prepare seeds, gather equipment, and fill water jars. When it came to the crucial chore of putting seed in the ground at the best time, nothing could be left to chance. There was one more crucial ceremony first, though. From its designated spot in a wall niche, Senbi produced a little wooden figurine. It stood for the god of rebirth and vegetation, Osiris. His green-painted skin represented the crops that were just beginning to grow. Senbi set the figurine on a little mat, and the family gathered around. He placed a small piece of bread and a few drips of beer in front of it as offerings to secure the gods' favor on their planting. Senon, the great Osiris, dies and resurrects like our fields' harvests. Grant our seed the ability to germinate and develop into a robust plant. Let our barley rise from the dark dirt into the light like you came back from the dead. It was a straightforward prayer, devoid of the complex formulas and rites of temple worship. Yet it established a direct line of communication between this lowly family and the cosmic powers they felt controlled the natural world. The distinction between the utilitarian and the religious was hazy in Egyptian philosophy. Their harvests relied on both heavenly favor and good farming practices to succeed. The figure was gently placed back in its niche following the little ceremony. The family finished the last chores of the day and got ready for bed. They would go to bed soon after nightfall and wake up with the sunrise, much like the majority of Egyptians. There was little incentive to remain up in the dark, and lamp oil was costly. They had basic sleeping arrangements. On the packed earth floor, reed mats were unfolded and covered with linen sheets for use in the cooler months or just for warmth in the warmer ones. No separate bedrooms were present. The whole family, including parents and kids, slept in the main room. The 8-year-old Jehuti raised a question that was obviously on his mind as they took their mats. "Why do we consume some seeds and so others, Father? They have the same appearance." In the dark, Seni grinned. It was a thoughtful inquiry that demonstrated the boy's awareness of his surroundings. He said, "We carefully select the seeds we plant. They are derived from the most robust plants, the ones that yielded the most grain and grew the best. We save them specifically for planting in order to ensure the strength of our new crops." The youngster insisted that they still had the same appearance as the ones we eat. "Yes, in our opinion," Senbi concurred. "The gods, however, are aware of the distinction. They perceive the power concealed within every seed, poised to blossom." The youngster became silent, apparently satisfied. Before long, the tiny space was filled with the steady breathing of youngsters who were asleep. But Kenset stayed awake a little longer. She was focused on the tasks for the following day. Planting needs attention to detail and precision. The seeds have to be dispersed equally, neither too sparsely nor too heavily. They needed to be pushed into the ground just far enough to keep them moist and safe, but not far enough to prevent the sprouts from getting sunlight. She went over each stage of the procedure in her head to be sure nothing had been overlooked. Just as crucial as the actual physical labor was this mental preparation. Memory and careful planning were vital in a society without written manuals or checklists. Senbi was already asleep next to her, recharging for the work of tomorrow. In the dark, she grinned, appreciating his constant presence, his farming expertise, and his commitment to their family. Together, they had endured both plenty and sparse harvests, as well as both excessive and insufficient floods. As always, they would approach whatever this year held with diligence, common sense, and faith in the never-ending cycle. As usual, dawn arrived early. The family was awakened by the first light coming in through the little windows high on the walls. No lingering in bed was allowed. Nobody was waiting on planting day. Fuel for the morning's labor came from a quick breakfast of leftover bread dipped in a paste made from ground fava beans. Next, the soaking seeds needed to be examined. As Kenset and Amenhat examined the barley seeds, they cautiously emptied the water from the clay pitcher. A positive sign was that they had somewhat swelled from the absorbed liquid. "They seem eager to grow," Kenset remarked contentedly. The seeds were separated into baskets by her. She has one for herself, Senbi has one, and the older kids have smaller ones. With planting, even the youngest would pitch in. Every human hand was required. The planting implements were basic. Each held a wooden hoe and a little sack of seed tied at the waist. In order to press the seeds into the ground at a constant depth, the adults also carried a board on a long handle. As the sun rose above the eastern horizon, the families strolled to their field. They weren't by themselves. Other families were doing the same age-old thing across the floodplain. As Egypt's farmers started the cycle of development that would keep the kingdom afloat for another year, the whole landscape pulsed with intentional energy. Senbi stopped for a quick prayer at the edge of the field, requesting again Osiris's blessing on their labor. Then they started without any further fanfare. It was an old and efficient procedure. Each adult and older child was in charge of a stretch of similar width as they traveled across the field in a queue. With deliberate hand sweeps, they dispersed seed from their bags as they went backward. The youngest kids came next, covering the seeds with dirt with tiny hoes. Nobody said much. They didn't require any training. This information was learnt via practice and observation. Even the kids understood their tasks and carried them out with surprisingly good performance year after year, generation after generation. As she worked, Kensit noticed that she was becoming almost contemplative. She was reminded of many women who had been doing this very same thing for thousands of years by the rhythmic action of dispersing seed, the feel of the grains against her fingers, and the scent of the moist earth. Time seems to fold in on itself at that very instant. She was more than just Kensit, Sabi's wife, and a mother of 4 children. She represented every Egyptian farmer who had ever sown seeds on the black ground that the gift of the Nile had left behind. The eternal cycle of flood, planting, and harvest that characterized life under the shadow of the Nile would be continued by her descendants, including her daughter and her future granddaughters. In the late afternoon, the town of Unu was bathed in golden light. An elderly man sat on a woven reed mat on a little rise with a view of the fields stretching to the horizon, his back leaning against the warm stones of a shrine to the Nile deity, Happy. Ipua was the oldest person in the village. 90 years of sun. Wind and laughter have left his face a map of wrinkles. Around him, children sat cross-legged on the ground, their eyes wide with excitement. It was an ancient custom. During the slower post-planting days, when the first fragile barley and wheat shoots were starting to turn the black earth green, the elderly man would impart age-old knowledge. "Tell us about the great flood," an excited little boy said, "the one that arrived in your youth." Ipua grinned, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Which one? In my lifetime, I have witnessed 82 floods. They are all the same and all distinct." A girl suggested the largest one. "The one that extended to the steps of the temple." "Oh." Slowly, the elderly man nodded. "The flood that occurred during Pharaoh Amonhotep's 12th year. I hope he lives forever." "Little Nefertari, I was around your age. I was just 8 years old." He leaned back against the stones and collected his thoughts. The kids anxiously waited. There was no urgency to get to the next entertainment or activity here. They loved stories, and they loved a good storyteller even more. "It started like any other flood," he added, his voice assuming the cadence of a well-told tale. Just before dawn, the star Suz emerged, signaling that a Ket would soon start. At the neometer, the priests kept an eye out for the first indications of water rising. However, it arrived sooner than everyone had anticipated. His twisted hands moved up and down, imitating the flow of the stream. The river had overflowed its banks in a matter of days. Water flooded the fields and continued to rise. Palm tree tops were used as navigational aids for boats. Bringing their animals and whatever belongings they could manage, families relocated to higher ground. Even though none of the kids had ever witnessed such a destructive flood in their lives, they listened in awe. Decades had passed since the last genuinely overwhelming flood. They were aware of the delicate balance that underpinned their existence. Famine resulted from insufficient water. Devastation was the result of too much. Ipua went on to say, "My father was a canal engineer who was called to help strengthen the levees protecting the temple granaries. I accompanied him, bringing his tools. I recall looking out over the lake as it stretched from horizon to horizon from the village's highest point. It resembled the primordial seas of Nu, from which the world originated during the gods' time." A 10-year-old youngster held up his hand. "Did you feel scared?" Ipure acknowledged that. "All of us were. However, the shadow of wisdom is dread. It instills in us a respect for powers beyond ourselves. We were right to be afraid when he stopped to give the kids time to process this idea." Many homes had been washed away when the water eventually subsided, 2 months later than usual. Instead of silt, sand blanketed the fields, in some locations. The land took 3 years to recover completely. However, the group's oldest girl, who is around 14, claimed that it did recover. Her voice begged for confirmation. Always. Ipure gave a strong nod. That is Egypt's miracle. As Osiris died and was reborn, so too does the land die and reincarnate. This is the Nile's gift, not only soil and water, but rejuvenation. He gazed down at the fields, where green sprouts were starting to change the scenery. Pare was the growing season during which the seeds that had been placed began to sprout and strive for the sun. Shemu, the harvest season when the mature grain is chopped, threshed, and stored, would follow Pa. The flood would then bring death and rebirth to the land again, and Akhet would return. The cycle never stops. Softly, almost to himself, Ipua spoke. Like the fish in the river or the birds in the sky, we are a part of it. Without hesitation, a younger child, maybe 5 years old, slid into the elderly man's lap. Ipua put a soft arm around his shoulders to greet him. The youngster, nestled into the Ellis's bosom, asked to be told about the neometer. Ipua grinned. One of the most popular topics was the Nilometer, a little human ingenuity that helps explain the enigmatic ways of the Nile. He started by saying that the first Nilometer was constructed during the reign of the god kings, prior to the unification of the two territories under the double crown. It was merely a stairway that descended into the river, with wall markings indicating the water's depth. Similar to the temples? A kid inquired. Yes, quite similar to that one, if not as well made. The design got better over time. Some Nilometers developed into wells with subterranean channels connecting them to the river. Others were water-standing columns that were measurement marked with cubits and palms. He extended his hand to reveal the breadth of his palm. On a man's arm, 1 cubit is equivalent to 6 palms from here to here. He pointed to the elbow to fingers distance. Famine is a menace, and the ideal flood is 16 cubits, which is less than 12. When the age exceeds 18, devastation ensues. How are the priests aware of the impending flood? A different kid inquired. Are they magical? Ipure laughed. Their magic, as some would say, is information that has been passed down through the generations. They keep an eye out for indications of how early the water starts to rise, the color of the initial floodwaters, how rapidly it rises. On papyrus scrolls, they document the floods and compare them to previous years. An older boy claimed that the royal engineers are developing a new type of niometer, according to my father. One that has the ability to forecast flood levels far in advance of our district's arrival. Ipu nodded. Yes. Close to the first cataract in Elephantine. 20 days before it reaches us here, water comes there. While the flood is still far off, we can know what to expect thanks to a Nilometer there and messengers that travel day and night. This was Egypt's way, continuous improvement of methods and expertise, but always within the parameters of custom. They measured the same eternal cycle that had supported life in the Nile Valley since before human memory, but new niometers might be constructed. The niometer reminds us of an important truth, he added, his voice assuming the soft rhythm that signaled the arrival of greater insight. The flood is beyond our control. The river cannot be made to rise precisely 16 cubits, neither more nor less. However, we can comprehend it, we can get ready for it. Instead of working against it, we can work with it. He turned to face each child, checking to see if they grasped the meaning. This is the Egyptian wisdom that has been preserved from the time of the gods. Mahat, or the right order of things, is not something we oppose. We discover where we fit in. Egyptian thinking was centered on the idea of Mahat, the notion that the universe should be kept in harmony, balance, and proper order. It controlled the motion of the stars, the administration of justice, human behavior, and natural cycles. Who can tell me what happens during Pir, the season we've just entered? Ipure asked, adjusting gently to comfort his elderly bones. All of the kids eagerly raised their hands to show off what they knew. "The plants grow," one of the younger participants stated. One of the elder boys added, "We weed the fields and make sure the irrigation channels work properly." Another said, "We pray to Osiris for strong crops and keep an eye out for pests." With every response, Ipure nodded. Yes, all of these things. Parade is the time of growth and care. We have done the hard work of preparing and planting. Now we tend and protect what we have begun. He gestured toward the fields below where families could be seen moving along the rows of emerging plants, carefully removing weeds and checking irrigation channels. Every day the seedlings grow stronger. Every day they reach higher toward Ra's light, and as they grow, we nurture them just as a mother nurtures her children. The little boy in his lap yawned, the peaceful rhythm of the old man's voice making him drowsy. Ipure smiled and continued, his tone becoming even more gentle and measured. After Pere comes Shemu, the time of harvest. The green plants turn golden under the hot sun. The grain heads become heavy and bend toward the earth. Then the sickles come out and the cutting begins. His hands mimic the motion of harvesting with a sickle, the curved blade slicing through the stalks, gathering them in bundles. The cut grain is taken to the threshing floor where oxmen walk in circles, their hooves separating the precious kernels from the chaff. Women winnow the grain, tossing it into the air so the breeze can blow away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain falls back to the mats. These were scenes every Egyptian child knew intimately. Even those who lived in cities or worked at crafts other than farming understood these fundamental processes that sustained all of Egypt. And then, if you were prompted, the grain goes into storage. Several children answered at once. Yes, into the granaries it goes. Some for eating throughout the year, some for trading, some for offerings to the gods, and the most perfect kernels are saved for the next planting. He made a circle with his finger. And so the cycle continues as it has since Osiris taught us to farm in the time before time. The mention of Osiris led naturally to another favorite topic. "Tell us about the gods of the Nile," requested a girl of about 12. Nodding, he settled into another well-told story. Osiris is also associated with the Nile because his body was concealed in the river by his evil brother, Set. The great river is beloved by many gods, Happy as the god of the flood itself, depicted with blue skin and a large belly full of abundance. He patted his own somewhat rounded stomach, making the children giggle. Just as the earth dies under the flood and is reborn when the waters recede, Osiris became the god of vegetation and rebirth after Isis found and healed him. The tone of the old man's voice became more somber. Some claim that Isis's tears for her deceased husband are what caused the deluge. Others claim it is Osiris's life-giving force, which returns annually to fertilize the soil. His eyes glistened as he gazed at the kids. Both might be true. We don't fully grasp how the gods operate. This was the norm for religious thinking in Egypt. It's possible for several, even seemingly incompatible, explanations to coexist. The understanding of divine powers at action in the natural world was more important than strict theological orthodoxy. The beginning of the deluge during the period when the gods walked on earth is the subject of another narrative. There was a devastating drought in Egypt. For respite, the villagers appealed to the solar deity Ra. Feeling sorry for them, Ra ordered his daughter, the ferocious goddess Sekhmet, to assist. Sekhmet, however, misinterpreted her father's order. Rather than bringing water, she went on a horrible spree and started killing Egyptians while consuming their blood. This abrupt change caused the children's eyes to widen. In anticipation, even those who had heard the story before leaned forward. Ra was appalled. He had beer tinted red to resemble blood in order to stop his daughter. And the fields were covered with thousands of jugs of this beer. Believing it to be blood, Sekhmet drank it all and was so inebriated that she dozed off for 3 days. Her anger had subsided by the time she woke up. She became into Hathor, a softer goddess. And ever since, the red-tinged waters of the flood, now recognized as the beer that saved humanity, would return annually to feed the earth. The kids gave a grateful nod. The reddish hue frequently observed in the initial flood waters, which was brought on by red silt that flowed down from the Ethiopian highlands, has a satisfactory explanation. "Are the stories true?" inquired a contemplative 9-year-old child. Ipuer gave the questions careful thought. In the most important sense, they are true. They aid in our comprehension of our role in the universe and our connection to forces bigger than ourselves. He gazed at the expansive sky above, the verdant fields, and the never-ending river beyond. The rising and falling of the Nile, the maturing of crops, and the sprouting of seeds are all ways that the gods communicate with humanity. The miracle is the same whether we refer to it as the deluge, Osiris, or Happy. The countryside was painted in golden amber by the lowering sun. Mothers would soon be calling their kids home for dinner. However, there was still time for one more tale. Ipuer said, "Let me tell you about the first flood when the world was new before you leave." The kids got comfortable. Even the sleepy ones were excited for this ancient story. There was nothing at first, just the watery abyss, and the old man spoke in a tone reminiscent of the oldest tales. The first land, a mound of soil, emerged from nothing, and Ato, the creator deity, stood atop it. In the air, his hands formed an imperceptible mound. Atom summoned the air, T-nut moisture, and Shu. GB, the ground, and Nut, the sky, came from them. And the gods who would govern the human world, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephos, came from GB and Nut. The world we know today was created when GB and Nut were split apart, with earth below and the sky above. The first rainfall, which accumulated and flowed to become the Nile, was created by the gods' tears. Now that they had been taken back to that legendary period of creation, the kids were silent. "When the river comes every year," Ipuer went on quietly, "it feels like a brand new planet is being built. The land is covered by the return of Nun's waters. And when they pass, new soil emerges, prepared for the resumption of life." Some of the kids were now struggling to keep their eyes open in the warm late afternoon air, but he still grinned at them. "We do not fear the flood because of this. Despite the fact that it can occasionally cause difficulty, it is a necessary component of creation, Mahat, and the proper order of things. Rebirth is impossible without death. No rebirth is possible without the devastation caused by the flood." The elderly guy fell silent, giving the kids time to process this last nugget of knowledge. The village was quieting around them as the work week came to an end. Families were coming home from the fields, cooking dinner and caring for their pets. Along the Nile, life's timeless rhythms persisted as they have for millennia. Parents or older siblings called the children away one by one, stopping to respectfully press their foreheads to the Aler's hand before departing. The youngest boy was soon all that was left, remaining curled up in Ipuera's lap. "Now go to sleep." The boy's mother came over with an apologetic smile. "I apologize, wise one." Every time you tell a story, Hanenu nods off. As she carefully lifted her son, she informed him that it was a compliment. Dreams should occasionally result from stories. The old guy, left alone, did not get up right away. After sitting for so long, his bones resisted movement. Furthermore, it was worthwhile to enjoy the view. The far mountains turning purple with the last of the light, the date palms swaying softly in the evening breeze, the verdant fields that reached to the river. This was Egypt, his Egypt. The everlasting country that had raised his forefathers and would continue to raise future generations. Ipuer had witnessed a lot of change in his 90 years. They had brought in new farming methods. Exotic things from far-off places had been brought by trade. The fundamentals had not changed despite the fact that various pharaohs had reigned, some wisely and others less so. The land continued to experience death and rebirth when the Nile flooded annually. Farmers continued to use the old calendar for planting and harvesting. Children continued to congregate to listen to elders narrate the ancient tales. This continuity was consoling. This involvement in cycles larger than any one person's existence. Unlike certain cultures, Egyptians did not fear death because they viewed it as a transition rather than an end, but rather as a part of a bigger pattern. If people had lived in accordance with May, and their hearts were judged worthy, they would also experience rebirth, just as the soil died under the flood, and then resurfaced more productive than before. At last, Ipuwer stood up, his joints groaning with well-known pains. He would go back to his daughter's house, where he had been for the past 15 years, ever since his wife joined Osiris in the reeds field. He would talk to his grandchildren over a basic lunch and maybe have a beer before bed. Another day of caring for the developing crops, keeping up with the irrigation systems, and taking part in the ever-changing cycles of life along the Nile would begin tomorrow. Long after Ipuwer himself had left for the afterlife, the deluge would return again and time again. With the wisdom of 82 floods, many crops and harvests, and a lifetime of living in harmony with the river that was Egypt's lifeblood, the old man slowly made his way towards the village as the first stars emerged in the deepening blue of the eastern sky. The essence of the ancient Egyptians' civilization, adaptability, and trust in the everlasting cycles that regulated all life was contained in their proverb, "The Nile gives, the Nile takes away, but Egypt endures." Far away in both space and time from those ancient farmers, you rest in your cozy bed. Maybe their narrative still has lessons to teach us. They recognized something we frequently overlook, that we are a part of bigger natural cycles than we are, that everything has a rhythm. It must be acknowledged and dealt with. It cannot be hurried or controlled. Even though modern dams now manage its waters, the Nile still flows today. Although tractors have taken the role of oxen and wooden plows, the black land still produces crops. Egypt has persisted for thousands of years, changing yet maintaining ties to its ancient origins. As you fall asleep, you might picture yourself there, experiencing the lush soil beneath your bare feet, listening to the sound of papyrus rustling in the soft wind, and observing the Nile's life-giving waters flowing by, just as they did during the Pharaoh's era. After seeing that serene picture, close your eyes and go to sleep.